Hey everyone, I hope y'all are doing well. Glad that you're here with me for a Bible study this morning. I'm so excited that we're going to be able to go back to church together soon, though I know it'll be a little strange with our social distancing guidelines, but I'm glad that we'll all be together and that we'll be joined and doing whatever it takes to keep one another safe. Your families should all be receiving some mail that includes a letter from Sunny and guidelines for what church is going to look like once we go back. And if you don't get that, or if you have any questions about that, please let me know. I'm happy to help with any of those things. Part of those guidelines say that we won't be able to have Bible class. And that's a decision that the elders and the some of the medical professionals in our congregation have made in conjunction with each other. And I'm really sad about that, but it's, I think, in the best interest of everyone in the church. Um, so I do plan to continue these Bible studies with y'all every Sunday. I may shorten them a little bit. I'm sure y'all will be furious to hear that. But we'll continue our study in the parables. And this week we're going to be reading the parable that Jesus tells at the end of Luke chapter 15. If you've got a Bible, go ahead and turn to Luke 15. We'll start reading in verse 11. And we've usually heard this parable called the parable of the prodigal son. Or in my Bible, it says the parable of the lost son. I bet your Bible says something similar, but those headings were actually added later to the text. You know, when the Bible was originally written 2,000 years ago, there was no little headings at the beginning of each section. They didn't even have chapter numbers or verse numbers or anything. Those were all added later to make it easier for us to find certain things. But the titles of these stories, the titles of these parables, aren't in the text. And Jesus doesn't say, now I'm going to tell you the parable of the prodigal son. And I don't even think that's the best title for this story. Of course, that's the title we all know and use, and that's fine. But I think the better title comes from the very first verse of the story, in verse 11. There was a man who had two sons. This parable is the parable of a man with two sons. That's what I call it. Because as we'll see, the story isn't just about the prodigal son or the lost son. The story is really split up into two different sections. And the first section is about the prodigal son, the younger son. But the second section is about his older brother. And each part of this story has its own meaning. But let's start reading the first section. I'll be reading out of Luke chapter 15, starting in verse 11. Jesus continued, There was a man who had two sons. The younger one said to his father, Father, give me my share of the estate. So he divided his property between them. Not long after that, the younger son got together all he had, set off for a distant country, and there squandered his wealth in wild living. After he had spent everything, there was a severe famine in that whole country, and he began to be in need. So he went and hired himself out to a citizen of that country, who sent him to his fields to feed pigs. He longed to fill his stomach with the pods that the pigs were eating, but no one gave him anything. When he came to his senses, he said, How many of my father's hired servants have food to spare, and here I am starving to death? I will set out and go back to my father and say to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Make me like one of your hired servants. So he got up and went to his father. But while he was still a long way off, his father saw him and was filled with compassion for him. He ran to his son, threw his arms around him, and kissed him. The son said to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. But the father said to his servants, Quick, bring the best robe and put it on him. Put a ring on his finger and sandals on his feet. Bring the fattened calf and kill it. Let's have a feast and celebrate. For this son of mine was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found. So they began to celebrate. Okay, so if you've heard this parable before, you probably have a bit of a sense of what part of the story is about. The Father obviously represents God. We talk about God as our Father. Jesus talks about God as the Father. And we, as sinners, are the younger brother. We are the prodigal sons and daughters. The thing is, even though God gives us the gift of life, every new breath you take is a gift from God. And God gives us work to do in his kingdom. And he gives us the promise of an inheritance of eternal life with him forever. We have all of the things the younger son has. A lot of times, we take all of those gifts, all of those blessings, and we squander them, don't we? We squander them. We waste them by living in sin. We waste them by taking God's gifts and using them just for ourselves instead of sharing them with other people. We know what we're supposed to do, but we don't do it. And just like the prodigal son, the younger brother, that gets us into trouble. We know what sins we shouldn't commit, but we do them anyway. And before long, we realize that our lives are lost and broken. Take 5 seconds and look into your life and tell me if you don't think that that's somewhat true. I think we all know that it is. And no, that doesn't mean we're all terrible, horrible, no good, very bad people. But the truth is, even those of us who try our hardest to live a good life find ourselves being selfish or greedy or prideful, getting angry with others, being ungrateful for things that people do for us. We make decisions we shouldn't. We do things when we're alone that we know we shouldn't do. We get into situations with other people that we know we shouldn't get into. We know that that's true, don't we? But what's just as true, maybe even more true, is the constant, eternal, never-ending response of the Father. God, our Father, always welcomes us back with open arms. And not only does he welcome us, he throws us a party and he calls us his beloved children. Just like the father in the story. In fact, our text tells us that while the son was still a long way off, his father saw him and ran to him and welcomed him home. God doesn't wait for us to get our acts cleaned up. He doesn't say, once you've got everything figured out, then I'll love you again. No, that's not how God operates. God never stops loving us. Even while we're still a long way from him, he's out there looking for us, searching for us, hoping that we'll come back to him. So that's the first message of this parable. It's a very simple message, but I think the story sort of helps us understand it on a more emotional and personal level. This is a message that we all need to hear, that no matter how many times we screw up, no matter how badly we think we've messed our lives up, God is always searching for us, hoping that we'll return to him. And today, if you feel a long way from God, I hope you'll know that he is constantly searching for you, hoping you'll return to him. If there's some brokenness in your life that you feel like is keeping you from God, I hope that you will pray to God about that this week. And I also hope that you'll reach out to me or reach out to Emily this week. If there's something in your life that you feel like is making your relationship with God more difficult, please reach out to me or to Emily. We'd love to talk with you about that, because those things are not a barrier between you and relationship with God. God the Father is always seeking you, and he loves you no matter what. We'd love to talk with you about what that looks like. If you don't hear anything else from this lesson this morning, I hope you'll hear this. God will always love you, no matter what. And he's always waiting for you to come home to him. And probably throughout our lives, many of us will find ourselves straying down the wrong path at different times. But you have never strayed so far that you can't return home to God. Okay, so I said there's 2 sections to this parable. We just talked about the first one. And the second section of the parable, the rest of the text, has sort of a different meaning. And I think that's one of the interesting things about parables is they don't usually have just like one main point. There's often 2 or 3 or 4 or 10 points. And we're just going to talk about 2 of them from this parable today. But we're going to spend the rest of our time looking at the second section. So we'll come back to our text and we'll pick back up reading in verse 25. Meanwhile, the older son was in the field. When he came near the house, he heard music and dancing. So he called one of the servants and asked them what was going on. Your brother has come, he replied, and your father has killed the fatted calf because he has him back safe and sound. The older brother became angry and refused to go in. So his father went out and pleaded with him, but he answered his father, Look, all these years I've been slaving for you and never disobeyed your orders. Yet you never gave me even a young goat so I could celebrate with my friends. But when this son of yours, who has squandered your property with prostitutes, comes home, you kill the fattened calf for him. My son, the father said, You are always with me, and everything I have is yours. But we had to celebrate and be glad because this brother of yours was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found. So earlier we said that God is the Father and we are the prodigals, the younger son. But I think we can also be the older son, the older brother. You know, in parables, it's not always the case that every character means exactly one thing, or every element of the story means exactly one thing. Sometimes there can be multiple different meanings, and sometimes we can play multiple different characters. And I think in this story, we're supposed to imagine ourselves both as the younger son, the prodigal, and as the older brother. At least sometimes we are. Have you ever found yourself getting frustrated or annoyed when it feels like somebody else gets something they don't deserve? When your little sibling gets some special thing that you didn't get when you were their age? Or when your older sibling doesn't get punished for doing something that you would have got punished for when you were, if you were them? We often think, that's not fair. I didn't get that special thing, or I got punished and they didn't. That's not fair. And we think that same thing about church sometimes, too. When I was in high school, there was a girl I went to high school with who had just a really bad reputation in school. She would go out on the weekends and do all sorts of things that I thought Christians shouldn't do. And because she had that reputation, that made her popular. People thought she was cool because she did those things. And the worst part about that was, every week she'd show up at church, and she was popular there too. Everyone loved her. Everyone acted so proud of her for going to church. But I was always so frustrated. I was like, don't you know what she does on the weekends? Haven't you seen the kinds of things she posts on social media? The kind of language she uses? The kind of people she hangs out with? It sounds a lot like the older brother, doesn't it? He's so mad that his father is welcoming back this prodigal son who went off and blew all the money. Do you notice what the older brother says in verse 30? He says two things. The first is he calls his younger brother, this son of yours. He doesn't say, my brother. He's trying to distance himself from his little brother. Have you ever done that with somebody who you don't think is really the right kind of person? You distance yourself, not because you're worried they're going to influence you, but because you're worried that other people are going to see you and think less of you because you're friends with them. That's not the way of Jesus. There are times when we need to remove ourselves from certain relationships because we're being influenced in negative ways. That's very true. And we have to maybe discern that within our own minds and maybe talk with people about that. But more often than not, when we're distancing ourselves from somebody, it's more because we're afraid of how we're going to look. That's what the older brother does here. He says, this son of yours, he's done all these bad things. The other thing the older brother says to the father in verse 30 is, he says, your son squandered all of your property with prostitutes. Now, what did our text tell us about what the younger brother did with the money? If you look back in verse 13, it says, he squandered his wealth in wild living. It doesn't say anything about prostitutes, which, by the way, if you're wondering what that is, now's a great time to ask your parents about that. But the older brother is making assumptions about all these bad, horrible things that his little brother did, but he doesn't even know what actually happened. We never really know the full story behind what somebody is doing, how they're living, what they've been through. You know, once I finally started to get to know that girl I was telling you about from my high school, I started to realize that a lot of the rumors and things I'd heard about her weren't as true as I thought they were. And some of them were true, but that didn't give me an excuse to treat her poorly. And I also started to learn more about her family, her past, difficult situations that she'd been through, and that helped me realize who she really was on the inside, which maybe affected the way she acted. And I'm not saying that just because somebody has had a difficult past, that gives them the right to behave in sinful or bad ways, but I never had any right to judge her, no matter what. In Matthew 7, Jesus tells us, do not judge, or you too will be judged. For in the same way you judge others, you will be judged. And with the measure you use, it will be measured to you. So maybe this week there's someone who you've had a hard time not being judgmental of. And God is challenging you to let it go and to stop trying to be the judge. That's God's job. That's not our job. And to just accept that person for who they are and to trust that God will take care of the rest. So we've been calling this series on parables Kingdom Stories because these parables Jesus tells teach us about God's kingdom. So my last thing I want to think about for just a second is, what does this parable teach us about God's kingdom? And if we think about God's kingdom as God's household, God's family, God's home, I think it's pretty clear. The door to God's kingdom is always open. There's not a locked gate or a wall or a barrier. God's door is always open to us and to other people, even when we don't think they deserve it. Because we don't deserve it either. But we are so blessed to have received God's love anyway. So this week, my challenge to you is evaluate your life, think about your life, and ask yourself, which brother am I right now? Am I the younger brother in need of asking for God's forgiveness? Or am I the older brother in need of extending forgiveness to somebody else? Thank you guys for being with me again this week. I hope you have a great week. Don't forget to tell your mothers Happy Mother's Day and do something special for them. Love you guys. Can't wait to see you all soon.